as a Christian yourself, I'm sure that by skeptics, there isn't a question that you haven't been asked as much as whether the Bible condones slavery. Most of the time, they don't bother to ask the question. They insist on the fact that it does condone slavery. And they take their verses in isolation here and there to try to do that. But the important question we have to answer is, what does the Bible say about slavery? If it's going to speak about it without this strong, like from Jesus, without this strong condemnation of it, without this very strong command to not do it, why? Why? Let's look at and answer some of these questions. So first, let's look at what the Old Testament said about slavery, because this is important too. We're not just New Testament believers. We believe the Old Testament. So if you look at verse 16, it says, it's in yellow, he who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or he is found in his hand, shall surely be put to death. So here, stealing someone and selling them into slavery was punishable by death. It was punishable by death. Not a great case of the Bible condoning slavery. Let's look at Deuteronomy 23, verses 14, 15, and 16. Notice how this starts off. Since Yahweh your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and to give your enemies over to you, therefore your camp must be holy, and he must not see anything indecent among you. So because God is in their camp, it has to be perfectly holy. There can't be any unrighteousness going on in God's presence at all. And it says if he does, he will turn away from you. And because God is holy and all, and you cannot have any indecent acts, and just think, this is God's very presence among people. This is a even frightening thing that you would tremble before. And so clearly no unholiness can happen. And verse 15 says, you shall not hand over to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall live with you in your midst, in the place which he shall choose, in one of your gates of the towns, where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. Do you see how this is very different, right? When there is unrighteousness going on, there's all sorts of evil happening in the world, right? Not just slavery. And let me preface by saying slavery in the Old Testament and the New Testament was fundamentally different than American colonial slavery. So we should not think specifically about that when we speak of slavery, though it's natural for us because that's the only kind of slavery we've really experienced and known in this country. So that makes sense. But remember not to read back into the biblical text what terms and words and things that you see now happening in the future back and impute them back to the Bible. But do you see how not only are you not allowed to hand him over back to his master, if he escapes, then he says even he shall live in your midst in the place he shall choose in one of your gates of the towns where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. He gets to choose where he lives among all the towns where it pleases him. This is a indication in the biblical text that God is in no way in favor of slavery, even the slavery that was going on at that time. He was not for it. He was not condoning it. We have in his law his commands about what happens if you do hand back a slave, if you do mistreat the slave, and if you kidnap a person to sell into slavery. These are grievous sins. And so that's what the Old Testament has to say. And the New Testament is consistent, though the New Testament has more to say. But that's what we'll conclude about the Old Testament. God forbids and condemns slavery in these verses. So let's move on to the New Testament. Okay. We have in Colossians 3, God speaking through Paul, and he's giving instructions about the family, and he does this several times. He'll give a list, and he'll start off with the wives, what they should do, the husbands, what they should do, the children, the fathers. So we get from wives, husbands, children, fathers, down here now to slaves. Slaves, in all things obey those who are your master according to the flesh, not with eye service as pleasers of men, but with integrity of heart, fearing the Lord. Obey your masters as slaves. God has sovereignly put you where you are with what you have and in your condition. And your encouragement to serve your master is just this: to serve him with integrity of heart. This is not just way of eye service, he says, not as men pleasers, not just as something on the outside of actually performing your duties as a slave, but inside, to have a reverence for your master, to have a love for your master, and to do it right here: integrity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, do your work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance. Serve the Lord Christ, for he who does wrong will receive the consequences of the wrong which he has done, and that without partiality. And then he goes on to talk about masters. Show to your slaves what is right and fair, knowing that you too have a master in heaven. So he gives instructions. The Bible is not calling, and this is what it seems to be that people expect from Scripture, and what God is ought to do. The fact that the whole socioeconomic structure of the Roman Empire was with slavery. Almost everybody was a slave. And so rather than calling for the overthrow, think about what that would be. God would have to be calling a civil war for Christians to pick up their swords and pick up their knives and go out into battle and what? Slay every single master, go against the Roman Empire. What exactly are they expected to do? And on top of that, why would God call Christians to do something that is contrary to how he calls them? He calls us to be peacemakers, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. God is the God of peace, and he calls all Christians to be people of peace, to love peace, to, as Paul says, as much as you're able, live peacefully among the people that you're living with, as much as possible. That's why he calls for us to pray for kings and all those who are in authority, so that you may live peaceful and quiet lives, he says. Okay, so in the New Testament now, we're being told, obey. Slaves, obey, not just outward from your heart, and not for men, but for Christ. You will receive your inheritance from Christ. Serve them as if you were serving the Lord. Isn't that what Matthew says what Jesus says in Matthew when he talks about the end of the days and the Son of Man? He said he will put the righteous on one side and the wicked on one side, and he will say to the righteous, you clothed me when I was naked. When I was sick, you took me in. When I was in need of water, you gave me water. And they say, well, Lord, when did we do those things? When did we see you unclothed and hungry and thirsty and sick? And he says, for whatever you have done to the least of these, you have done also to me. And so that is the context in which a slave is to obey their master, knowing that at that time, Jesus will call them as righteous and give them an inheritance in relationship to how they served Christ. And so Christ will say at that time how he will reward them for serving him as a master, even though they were serving a man. Let me point out something. In Romans 6:13. And this is what I want to point out. All of us are slaves. We are all properly called slaves in the New Testament. And this is one place where Paul does it. It's not a matter of whether we're a slave or not. It's a matter of whose master are we a slave to? Which master? In Romans 6, verse 17, he says, "But thanks be to God that though you were slaves of sin, you obeyed from the heart the pattern of teaching to which you were given over. And having been freed from sin, you become slaves of righteousness." Slaves of sin and then slaves of righteousness. You are a slave either way. It is just one to sin and one to righteousness. That's the only distinction. But let's actually go deeper with why specifically God didn't call for an overthrow of the Roman government and to destroy the socio and economic structure which existed in first century Palestine. Because as Christians, we look to Christ, right? And this is what Christ said to Pilate. Verse 35, Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation, chief priest, delivered you to me. What did you do?" Because he asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says that he is. And then Jesus goes on to say, Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be delivered over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Jesus reigns over the entire universe. The entire universe. He gives us every breath that we have. But Jesus said, and we as Christians must follow, my kingdom is not of this world. In the book of Hebrews, we're talked about, and in 1 Peter, as sojourners, as exiles. Why? Because we are in a land that is not our home. And Hebrews chapter 11 says at the end that God is not ashamed to be called their God, those who obey in faith. He's not afraid to be called their God, for he has the true city which he will give to them. And so that's why Christians are not fighting in this world, why we're not fighting against slavery. We are submitting. We instead are submitting, just as Jesus submitted to becoming incarnate, to taking on human flesh and becoming obedient even to the point of death, right? Jesus' humility is what we must aspire to in our humility. And Jesus's kingdom is not of this world. Jesus has a kingdom and he will reign in his kingdom over the entire earth in his return. But as of now, his kingdom is not of this world. And so our heavenly home is not of this world. His servants do not fight. We, as his servants, do not fight. That's why Christians are always ones who obey, who submit, even to unrighteousness, because that's what we were called to be obedient as Christ was to whoever and wherever God has placed us. That is not what people want to hear today, but it is what the Bible says. It seems that skeptic scholars and skeptics in general want an answer of a war cry. That just shows they do not understand how Jesus came. He came in humility. He came and lived among the poor. He was poor. The King of all the earth, the King of kings, the God who upholds the universe, was walking not in king's palaces, but on the dusty gravel of first century Palestine in a poor family. So let's live as Christ lives. And this is what the Bible has to say. This is what it says about slavery. This is why we don't fight against slavery in a war. And this is why we accept every single text that talks about obedience of a slave to their master. So when you are asked about this question, when you are asked about slavery, when you are told that slavery was condoned by God, you can say, no, look here in the Old Testament, you have Exodus, you have Deuteronomy, in which in Exodus, if somebody steals a man and sells him, he's punished by death. And then God commands in the holy place where he is holy, where his kingdom, where he is reigning in his presence among the people of Israel, there can't be any slavery. He says he gets to choose where he lives. You don't hand him back over to his master. The New Testament calls for obedience of slaves to their master, because we don't fight as servants of Christ, because Christ's servants did not fight as Christ held back his army of angels for the sake and purpose of obedience to God. We must do the same. And so I hope that was helpful in helping you understand what the Bible has to say about slavery. And people can like it or dislike it. We have a holy God who has given us his word, and he has spoken as such. And it makes perfect sense to me. When you put Jesus as our example, everything falls in place. Everything falls into place as to how we're to be in an evil world. So thanks, guys, for joining me, and I'll see you guys in the next video.